Before George Washington took the oath of office in 1789, another man had already held the title of President in America, though not in the way history books usually tell it. Hidden in the pages of early U.S. history lies a surprising figure who led the nation under the Articles of Confederation, years before the Constitution was even signed. This forgotten leader's story challenges what we think we know about America's beginnings and reveals a chapter of history most people have never heard. Get ready to meet the real first president of the United States, before Washington. When you hear the phrase, first president of the United States, one name comes to mind almost without thought: George Washington. His towering figure in history, both literally and figuratively, has long been the cornerstone of America's origin story. We imagine him crossing the Delaware, leading Continental forces to victory, and later, reluctantly taking on the presidency as a unifying figure for a fragile new nation. But here's the twist. George Washington was not the first man to serve as president in the history of the United States. Before Washington took the oath in 1789 under the U.S. Constitution, there was a different kind of America, one bound together under a looser system called the Articles of Confederation. And under that early arrangement, there was indeed a president, just not the president we imagine today. The man most often recognized as holding that title first was John Hanson, though even that comes with historical debate. To understand this surprising truth, we have to peel back the polished surface of U.S. history and step into a period of uncertainty, experimentation, and political improvisation. America before the Constitution. When the colonies declared independence in 1776, they did not instantly become the United States as we know them today. They were 13 sovereign states loosely allied against a common enemy, Britain. The Continental Congress acted as the central governing body, but there was no executive branch, no judiciary, and no strong centralized government. The war was raging, resources were scarce, and the states jealously guarded their independence. To formalize this alliance, the delegates drafted the Articles of Confederation, America's first constitution. Ratified in 1781, the Articles created a perpetual union of states. But it was a union with a very weak center. The Articles gave Congress the ability to declare war and peace, conduct foreign affairs, maintain an army and navy in theory, coin money, but there was no power to tax citizens directly, regulate interstate trade, enforce laws on the states. Within this framework, Congress needed a presiding officer, a President of the United States in Congress assembled. This position was not the same as the later executive presidency. It was more like a chairperson or ceremonial head, but it was still the highest official role in the national government at the time. Enter John Hanson, the forgotten first president. When the Articles of Confederation were finally ratified on March 1, 1781, the Continental Congress transformed into the Congress of the Confederation. The delegates needed someone to preside over it, and in November that year, they elected John Hanson of Maryland as the first to serve a full one-year term in that role. Who was John Hanson? John Hanson was a merchant and public servant from Maryland who had been active in colonial and revolutionary politics. He was not a household name even in his own time, but his colleagues respected him for his organizational skills, reliability, and diplomacy. What did Hanson actually do? Hanson's role was not to lead the country in the modern presidential sense. He had no power to veto laws, no authority to command the military, and no independent executive powers. But his term did coincide with a crucial moment in the nation's development. During his presidency, the Revolutionary War was still ongoing. The victory at Yorktown in late 1781 was a turning point, but peace was not yet official. The Great Seal of the United States was adopted. This enduring symbol still appears on U.S. passports and currency today. The Department of Foreign Affairs, precursor to the State Department, was established. Arrangements were made for the first National Thanksgiving Day. In short, while Hansen didn't run the country the way we think of a president doing today, he presided over a Congress that was guiding the nation through a delicate moment. The confusion and the myth. Some popular history claims that John Hanson was the first president of the United States. Full stop. That's not quite accurate. He was the first to hold the presidential title under the fully ratified Articles of Confederation, but not the first to preside over the Continental Congress. Before Hanson, several men served as presidents of Congress during the Revolutionary period. Figures such as Peyton Randolph, Henry Middleton, John Hancock, and others had already taken turns leading congressional sessions. However, these earlier presidencies were not under the Articles, and the title did not carry the United States in Congress assembled designation. The debate comes down to definitions. If you define President of the United States as the head of the U.S. government in any form, Hanson fits the bill before Washington. But if you define it as the constitutional executive presidency we have today, Washington remains the uncontested first. Why Washington overshadows Hanson? History remembers Washington because his role was fundamentally different and far more powerful than Hanson's. Under the 1787 U.S. Constitution, the presidency was a separate branch of government, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, Chief Diplomat, Chief Executive enforcing federal laws, holder of veto power. Washington's presidency was also steeped in symbolism. He was unanimously elected. He set enduring precedents, like the two-term limit, later codified in the 22nd Amendment, and he embodied unity in a way no other figure of the time could. By contrast, Hanson's role was administrative and temporary, and the Articles of Confederation proved to be so weak that they were replaced after just a few years. That constitutional change essentially erased the memory of the earlier presidents from popular history. The Articles' other presidents. If we're being precise, John Hanson was not the only president under the Articles. In fact, 8 men served in that position between 1781 and 1789. John Hanson, Maryland, 1781 to 1782. Elias Boudinot, New Jersey, 1782 to 1783. Thomas Mifflin, Pennsylvania, 1783 to 1784. Richard Henry Lee, Virginia, 1784 to 1785. John Hancock, Massachusetts, 1785 to 1786. Nathaniel Gorham, Massachusetts, 1786 to 1787. Arthur St. Clair, Pennsylvania, 1787 to 1788. Cyrus Griffin, Virginia, 1788 to 1789. These men each presided over Congress, keeping order, signing official documents, and representing the Confederation government. But none wielded the concentrated powers we associate with a president today. Why this matters? You might wonder, why even bother talking about this? Isn't it just a quirky footnote in history? In one sense, yes, but in another, it's a reminder of how fluid and messy the early United States really was. 1. It shows the evolution of American government. The fact that we had a president years before the modern presidency existed reveals that the U.S. system didn't spring into being fully formed. It evolved through trial and error, with multiple models tested before settling on the Constitution's framework. 2. It challenges the simplified school version. Most Americans learn a streamlined narrative: colonies, Declaration, War, Washington, Constitution. In reality, there were many intermediate steps, compromises, and forgotten figures. Learning about people like John Hanson helps us see the gaps in that simplified story. 3. It highlights the fragility of the early republic. The Articles of Confederation era was marked by economic trouble, interstate disputes, and weak central authority. Recognizing this helps us appreciate why the stronger executive position of the modern presidency was seen as necessary in 1787. Debunking common myths about Hanson. Over the years, the John Hanson was the first president claim has taken on a life of its own, often with some embellishment. Let's set the record straight on a few points. Myth: Hanson was the first president of the United States in the same way Washington was. Reality: Hanson's role was presiding officer of Congress, more like a speaker or ceremonial chair. Myth: Hanson was a major public figure of the Revolution. Reality: he was respected among his peers, but he was not a household name like Washington, Jefferson, or Adams. Myth: Hanson's presidency was hidden deliberately. Reality: it wasn't so much hidden as overshadowed and rendered obsolete by the Constitution's new system. The road from Hanson to Washington. After Hanson's term ended, the Confederation government limped along for several more years. It managed to conclude the Revolutionary War with the Treaty of Paris in 1783, but it struggled to pay debts, regulate trade, or prevent uprisings like Shays' Rebellion in 1786. By the late 1780s, it was clear that the Articles of Confederation were inadequate. The Constitutional Convention of 1787 produced a new document with a stronger central government, including a singular executive branch, the presidency. When the new government took effect in 1789, George Washington was unanimously chosen as the first president under the Constitution. This was a vastly more powerful and clearly defined role than Hanson's, and Washington's leadership cemented the office's legitimacy. Legacy and recognition. Today, John Hanson's legacy is mixed. In Maryland, he is honored as a significant state figure. His image appeared on a U.S. postage stamp in 1981 for the bicentennial of the Articles. A statue of him stands in the U.S. Capitol's National Statuary Hall collection. Still, outside of history enthusiasts and Maryland locals, his name remains obscure. Whether you call him the first president or the first president under the Articles, his story adds nuance to the way we understand America's early leadership. A broader perspective on firsts. The John Hanson story also prompts a larger question. How do we define firsts in history? Is it about holding a title or about shaping an office into what it becomes? In Hanson's case, he had the title, but not the powers we associate with a modern president. In Washington's case, he had both the title and the defining influence. It's similar to asking, who was the first pilot, someone who flew a glider or someone who flew a powered airplane? Both can be correct, depending on how you frame the answer. Rewriting the mental script. When we think of U.S. history, there's a comfortable mental script that most of us have carried since school. 13 colonies declare independence, fight a revolution, win against all odds, and then hand the leadership reins to George Washington, the first president of the United States. He stands at the dawn of the Republic, setting precedents and shaping a new democracy from scratch. It's a clean story, easy to remember, and full of symbolism. But the truth, like most truths in history, is more complicated. While Washington was indeed the first president under the U.S. Constitution, he was not the first man to bear the title President of the United States in an official capacity. Before the Constitution, before the presidency as we know it, there was another America, an America run under a different system called the Articles of Confederation. And under that system, there were presidents, men who presided over the national government years before Washington took office. The most famous of these was John Hanson, who served in 1781 to 1782. Recognizing him and others like him doesn't take anything away from Washington. It simply rewrites the mental script we've been given, replacing a straight, simple line with a more textured and layered truth. Why the script exists in the first place. The way we remember history isn't always about accuracy. It's about narrative. Founding era America needed heroes, and George Washington was a near-perfect one. He was tall, dignified, victorious in war, and willing to walk away from power. A rarity in the late 18th century. He became the embodiment of unity at a time when the new country was dangerously fragile. From the perspective of national storytelling, it made sense to start the presidential story with Washington. The Articles of Confederation were already seen as a failed experiment by the time of the Constitution's adoption in 1789. Why muddy the story with a parade of short-term, relatively powerless congressional presidents whose titles and duties barely resembled the modern presidency? Thus, early American school books tended to omit them entirely, starting history's presidential list with Washington and leaving out figures like John Hanson, Elias Boudinot, and Richard Henry Lee. What the Articles of Confederation actually created. To understand why there were presidents before Washington, we need to understand the Articles of Confederation, ratified in 1781. This was America's first attempt at a national constitution, and it reflected the colony's deep suspicion of centralized authority after years under British rule. Under the Articles, Congress was the sole branch of national government. Each state had one vote in Congress, regardless of population or size. Congress could make war, negotiate treaties, and handle diplomacy. It could not levy taxes directly or regulate interstate trade. There was no separate executive branch, no national court system. The presidency created under the Articles was officially called the President of the United States in Congress assembled. The role was largely ceremonial and administrative, chosen by members of Congress to preside over meetings, sign official documents, and represent the Confederation in a symbolic way. The position had none of the independent powers Washington would later wield. No veto, no ability to appoint cabinet officials, no control of the military. Still, in form and in title, it was the top national office in existence at the time. John Hanson, the most famous first. John Hanson of Maryland was elected the first president under the fully ratified Articles of Confederation in November 1781. He served a one-year term, as the Articles required. What Hanson did, while his role was limited, Hanson's term coincided with significant developments. Oversaw the adoption of the Great Seal of the United States, still in use today. Helped manage the transition from wartime to peacetime governance. Initiated measures for the first National Thanksgiving Day. Managed communication and coordination between the states. Hanson didn't command armies or set sweeping policies, but his office was a necessary fixture in holding the Confederation together during a turbulent time. The other forgotten presidents. Hanson was the first under the fully ratified Articles, but he was followed by a line of 7 other men. Elias Boudinot, 1782 to 1783, oversaw the conclusion of the Revolutionary War. Thomas Mifflin, 1783 to 1784, helped implement the Treaty of Paris. Richard Henry Lee, 1784 to 1785, advocate for states' rights. John Hancock, 1785 to 1786, famous signer of the Declaration, but ill during much of his term. Nathaniel Gorham, 1786 to 1787, dealt with economic instability. Arthur St. Clair, 1787 to 1788, supported the move toward constitutional reform. Cyrus Griffin, 1788 to 1789, served until Washington's inauguration. Their collective leadership bridged the gap between independence and the Constitution, even though their titles and duties bore little resemblance to the modern presidency. Why Washington is still the first in the modern sense. The key to rewriting the mental script is understanding the definition of president. Under the Articles, the role was closer to a moderator or ceremonial head of Congress. Under the Constitution, the role became an independent executive branch, commander-in-chief of the armed forces, chief diplomat and head of state, veto power over legislation, responsibility to enforce laws. Washington was the first to hold that office, the presidency as an executive institution with real power. His unanimous election in 1789 and his precedent-setting 2 terms cemented him as the origin point of the presidency we recognize today. How history gets flattened. History is messy, but textbooks and public memory often prefer it tidy. We can see this in other areas. The idea that Christopher Columbus discovered America, ignoring the indigenous peoples already here. The simplified version of the civil rights movement focusing only on Martin Luther King Jr., leaving out countless local leaders. The myth of the Wild West as a lawless frontier, ignoring the complex social and economic realities. In the same way, the idea that Washington was the first president is true in one sense, but oversimplified in another. Flattening history may make it easier to teach, but it also erases the stepping stones that led to later achievements. Why rewriting the script matters. Some might say, so what? Hansen's role was nothing like Washington's. Why even mention him? But rewriting the mental script isn't just about technical accuracy. It's about appreciating historical continuity. Seeing the pre-constitutional presidents shows us that the U.S. didn't leap from revolution to a fully formed government overnight. There was a transitional period of experimentation and compromise, recognizing forgotten figures. Men like Hansen and Boudinot are barely remembered today, yet they played roles in stabilizing the new nation when it could easily have fractured. Understanding the fragility of the early republic. The Articles era showed that without a strong executive, the national government struggled to function, a lesson that directly influenced the Constitutional Convention. Learning to question official narratives. If something as fundamental as who was the first president can be more complicated than we think, what else in our mental history might deserve a second look? The political lessons of the Articles era. The presidency under the Articles was weak by design. The founders feared centralized authority after their experience with the British monarchy. But in practice, that weakness led to interstate disputes over trade and borders, difficulty raising revenue for national needs, inability to quickly respond to crises like Shays' Rebellion. The eventual constitutional presidency was a direct response to these shortcomings. It created a single executive with the authority to act decisively, while still constrained by checks and balances. This makes the Articles era presidents historically significant. They represent the bridge between colonial governance and constitutional governance. Reframing the question. When someone asks, was George Washington the first U.S. president, the most accurate answer is yes, if you mean the first president under the Constitution, the first executive leader of the United States as we know it. No, if you mean the first person to hold the title President of the United States in any form. This reframing invites discussion instead of a flat yes or no. It acknowledges Washington's unique role without erasing the figures who came before him. The symbolic power of Washington's presidency. Even if we include Hansen and others in the narrative, Washington's presidency still towers over them because he was the unanimous choice of the nation. He established precedents like the inaugural address, the presidential cabinet, and peaceful transfer of power. His personal reputation unified factions at a time of deep political division. He chose not to run for a third term. reinforcing the principle that the presidency is a temporary trust, not a lifetime position. The Articles era presidents were caretakers of a fragile experiment. Washington was the architect of a lasting institution. The broader implications of rewriting the script. Changing how we talk about the first president has ripple effects. In education, it encourages a more nuanced approach to history, showing that titles and institutions evolve. In public memory, it fosters respect for lesser-known historical figures. In civic understanding, it reminds us that government structures are not fixed. They are the result of trial, error, and adaptation. It also helps break the habit of treating history as a set of isolated events rather than as a continuum. Washington's presidency didn't appear out of thin air. It was a product of years of political evolution, negotiation, and compromise. A more honest story. So, was George Washington the first U.S. president? In the constitutional sense, absolutely. But if we broaden the definition to include the presidents of the Articles of Confederation era, he was preceded by men like John Hanson, whose roles were different, but whose titles were the same. Rewriting the mental script doesn't mean tearing down the statues of Washington or rewriting the Constitution. It means enriching the narrative, adding the footnotes, the side characters, and the transitional chapters that make history more complex, more accurate, and ultimately more interesting. The truth is, America's presidency wasn't born fully formed in 1789. It emerged from a messy, experimental, often frustrating process. By remembering the leaders who came before Washington, we acknowledge that the Republic's foundations were laid not in a single heroic moment, but in a long, winding journey of trial and error. And maybe, just maybe, the next time someone confidently says, George Washington was the first president of the United States, you'll smile, pause, and say, well, that depends on how you define first. History is full of surprises, and the story of America's true first president is one of its best-kept secrets. Long before Washington's face graced the dollar bill, this overlooked leader helped shape a fragile new nation and set the stage for the government we know today. By uncovering his legacy, we not only rewrite the way we see U.S. history, but also honor the forgotten figures who played pivotal roles in its creation. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the past, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more untold stories that will change how you see history.